then I'll reintroduce her. Okay, perfect. So Ariane trained as a biologist and worked for several years as an ecology technician on wildlife projects. During her PhD, she developed her expertise on the spatial eco-epidemiology of infectious diseases, particularly tick-borne diseases. This project allowed her to further develop her fieldwork skills, including sampling design for ecological studies and the capture and handling of birds and small mammals. She now works as an epidemiologist at the Public Health Agency of Canada on tick-borne disease prevention and surveillance. So thank you very much, Ariane. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Natasha. So hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about host sampling methods. I used these methods during my PhD, which was about the eco-epidemiology of the black-legged ticks and the pathogens that these ticks transmit, with a focus on Lyme disease. And now I work at the Public Health Agency of Canada as an epidemiologist. So here is the presentation outline for today. First, we'll talk about study design, and we'll see some specific information about capture methods, handling methods, and sample collection methods. I will finally share some information about how you can obtain the different permits and approvals for the host sampling protocols you may want to deploy. And I will end with some safety aspects you have to consider. So first, what is the purpose of deploying host sampling in the context of tick-borne disease studies? There are many relevant questions that you may want to answer in your studies. For example, you could look at the role of species in a given ecosystem in the dynamics of disease transmission. For example, which species act as reservoirs, which do not. You may want to determine the abundance of host and the reservoir species in that ecosystem, knowing that the more abundant a species is, well, the more important its role is likely to be in the disease transmission dynamics. You may want to test the effect of host treatments, like for example, some people in our lab are testing acaricide treatments to mice, and they have to capture the mice to look at the different effectiveness of those treatments. There are also some studies about the dispersal of ticks and pathogens through hosts, or monitoring of the emergence of new diseases or tick species in a given region using sentinel species, for example. So there are many different techniques that exist for sampling various species. There are some cases where the study requires sampling of hosts with lethal methods, but in my case, I didn't use these methods. And today I will focus on live capture methods for small mammals and birds. So I will just do a quick overview of what are the techniques that I used during my PhD. So when you are planning your study, the study design, there are different aspects you may want to consider. It's quite hard at the beginning to evaluate what will be the efforts and the resources you will need to reach the goals of your study. It is good to have like a phase when you can try different things and see what works in the specific terrain you are working in. If you want to detect pathogens in ticks or in hosts, you will need to consider, for example, what is the prevalence of the pathogen in the ticks, and the prevalence of the infestation of hosts by ticks and the density of infestation, because it will greatly influence the sample size you are likely to obtain if you deploy capture efforts. If you want to assess the density of a specific host species in the habitat, you will need to have a certain number of captures and recaptures. So you will have to capture the animal, knowing who is who, and have a certain amount of recapture to apply CMR methods, which are capture, mark, recapture, the way you can evaluate the population density. There are several factors that will influence the amount of efforts and of resources you have to deploy to obtain sufficient samples. For example, the accessibility of the terrain you will be working in, the topography. It may be really important if you have to move around a lot of equipment. It's important and you will need some help. How often you will move your equipment. These are all some very important considerations. And also in some cases, you'll have to work around with the weather. To be flexible with your work schedule, because the weather can influence what you can and cannot do in the field. And you have to keep that in mind always to ensure that the animals, the well-being of the animals you are working with. I will start with the methods for small mammals. We can use different types of traps depending on the target species. On the left, you have a picture of a Sherman trap, which is the one we commonly use to capture mice. Normally, we use a mixture of peanut butter as a bait, and we add into the trap an insulated foam, a foam that acts as an insulation for the animals to prevent the hypothermia for animals when they are catched inside the trap. We can also add a small piece of apple or potato so they can eat that and remain hydrated during the time that they are caught in the trap. In the photo on the left, you can see that the trap is camouflaged under the leaves and positioned along a dead tree underground. These are small details that can greatly improve the success of the capture, because the rodents tend to move along in the forest along the dead woods, so they can easily hide from predators and stuff like that. So these are some little tricks that you can use to improve your capture success. There are also larger traps like the ones in the picture in the center. These ones can be used for squirrels or raccoons, for example. For all those three traps, the principle is really simple. You have a bait inside, and when the animal passes, it presses the lever that makes the door close. And normally they don't get hurt at all during that process. And on the last picture, it's a pit trap. So these ones are normally used for smaller animals like shrews. So they just they simply pass by and fall in the trap, and that's how you cut them. Here I have illustrated the layout of the traps in a grid. This is a layout that we commonly use for capturing mice. The size of the grids can be adjusted according to the effort required for your study, depending on your objectives. In my case, I had several small grids like this one at different locations in the same park. And I wanted to compare, well, different stuff, but I wanted to know what is the density of mice from one side to another. And to set up such a grid, it's important to use like a compass to orient yourself in the forest to space the traps in a constant way, because the spacing of the traps is something important to consider if you have to do a density estimation, which was my case. So you can use forestry tapes to easily mark the transects and the trap locations, so you can easily find the traps when you return to do the checks. And we had a little problem. Well, the peanut butter used to smell very good, not only for mice, But I don't know if you can see on my picture, but these little guys here, the raccoons, were really interested in the peanut butter. So they used to come feast at night and eating the baits and moving the traps around, showing them everywhere. And we couldn't capture any mice because of those raccoons. So what we finally did is that we installed raccoon traps, which allowed us to keep the raccoons still each night and prevent them from disturbing the mouse traps. It was a bit complicated and we were not interested in the raccoons, but it greatly improved our capture success for the mice. In the case of my project, I had several sites with such trap grids that I sampled each week at the same time. So trapping at a specific location was done during a 1 week period. So I had like 8 grids, and during the week I visit all the trap with the team. So we would set up and activate the traps on Monday, late afternoon, do the captures all the week, then remove and clean everything on Fridays. And then on the next week, we would move the traps to new sites and do this all over again until we had done all the sites. You can see on the schedule here that I have put just as an example, but something important is that the traps are activated at the end of the day, so around 3 or 4 p.m. and are checked really early in the next morning. This is important because you have to ensure that the animals are not left in the trap for too long to ensure good survival rate and to minimize like the stress that we have on the animals. So once the traps are settled, you will go back and check every trap in the next morning, and you have to take all the traps that has an animal in it and to treat this in a very effective way. So I recommend setting up a good handling station. So you can see a setup here, which was done. It's not mine. It's really nice. It's done by Raphael Odelego, which did our field work last summer in Bromont, working on anaplasmos. So it's important to be well set up with tables and chairs, and to have some place when you can work in the shade and out of the rain if there is any rain on that day. It's important also, like in public parks, to have this set up away from the trails, because people get very curious and it can be easily difficult to manage for the research team to answer the questions and to be well focused on the delicate manipulations you have to do with the animals. So for small mammals, to do a good inspection and to collect the ticks or any samples you may want to collect, it's important to work with the animals under anesthesia. To do the anesthesia, we used an adapted isoflurane vaporizer for the field. So normally the vaporizer is connected to a machine that controls the amount of gas that is going to the animal, but we used a balloon that a person would manually pump to manage the amount of gas. So to do that, you need two people, one to operate the vaporizer and the other one to perform the manipulations on the animal. Here are just some examples of the type of samples that you can collect. For the ticks, they are mostly found in the larval stage on mice, and they are located on the ears of the mice, like we can see on the picture in the left. So you can remove every tick from the mice with the fine tweezers, and then analyze these ticks in the laboratory. In the picture in the center, you can see subcutaneous microchip injection. Microchips were used to mark individually the animals. For example, when you need to do the density estimates, you have to give every animal a unique identifier number. And if you recapture an animal, you will scan it and see who it is. In the last picture, you see a sampling of an ear skin biopsy. So you can use those biopsy to perform a PCR test and detect any pathogen you may be interested in. And once you're done with all of those manipulations, it's important to release the animals in the same place that they were captured. This way they can easily find their way back to their home, their little burrow or shelter. But it's also important, for example, if you want to follow their movements, if you recapture them later, well, you have to minimize like your impact on the animals' movements. So these are good practices to adopt. Now I will move on to the birds. So as part of my PhD, I also carried out captures of breeding birds. For example, I wanted to identify the bird species that could act as a reservoir for Borrelia burgdorferi, to compare their contribution of these birds to that of rodents in the transmission cycles of Borrelia. So I use nets like the ones that you can see on the picture. These are called mist nets. They are very thin and almost invisible to the birds when they are deployed like this. So birds will get caught in the nets as they move around. Or we can also lure them into the nets, but I will explain this just after. So normally the mist nets are used in rather open or shrubby environments, as we were seeing on the previous picture. So in that case, it's quite easy to capture the birds. We position the nets in strategic places where the birds will fly. So we'll position the nets between two trees or shrubs, and birds will pass by and get caught. But in case of my project, I also wanted to be able to capture the bird species that live into the forest. And it was quite a challenge to catch them in the forest, because forest birds tend to move like much higher from one branch to another in the forest trees. So we don't catch them with just by putting the nets in the forest. So what we did is that we used auditory lures to attract the birds into the nets. So during the nesting season, most bird species are territorial. So if you play a song that simulates another bird, it's seen as a competitor, an intruder in the territory of the bird, and you will provoke a bird to move into that specific area. And well, birds can get really angry when you do that. So this was used as a strategy to catch them. But yeah, it required a lot of patience in some cases, and of strategy too. So when a bird flies in, it will get caught. Their feeders will get caught in the net, and they stay there. It's very important for the safety of the birds not to leave them too long in that position. Especially in the sunny days or cold mornings, they can quickly become exhausted and fall into difficulty if they are left too long. And also, we would never left the nets open when if it's too hot or too cold, or if it's raining. We close the nets automatically. Then, yeah, we need a specific technique to remove the the birds from the nest without harming them. It's very delicate, and you need a lot of practice and patience to do that. And once we have the bird got out of the net, we put them in the cotton bags to transport them and do the rest of the manipulations. And normally they are really quiet while they are in the bag because it's dark and they don't really understand what's going on, so they stay very calm. Regarding the samples that can be taken, it's quite similar to what we've seen for rodents, but there are some small differences. First of all, we don't anesthetize birds. They are generally much calmer and easier to restrain compared to rodents. And also, I'm not really aware of how we could anesthetize them on the field. But we were able to inspect them and remove the ticks from them quite easily. We found the ticks mainly on birds' heads, around their beaks and their eyes, because these are areas that they cannot groom themselves using their beaks. To identify the birds, like with the unique identification numbers, like we did for the rodents, we didn't use microchips, we use bands. So these are bands that are managed by the Institute for Bird Populations at the scale of the North America. And it's quite easy to put the band on the bird's leg, but again, it's a specific technique that you need to do with great care, because they will have this band for like the rest of their lives. So you need to choose the right one so that the leg can grow and don't hurt the bird's leg. In the picture above, I just wanted to show that like looking at the bird's feathers can give you some indices about the sex and the age of the birds. So we compare the plumage patterns, for example, in the wing to chart, and we can determine the bird's sex and age. And in the last picture, we see this poor little bird being weighted upside down in the pill jar. And this was usually the last step we did before releasing the birds. And unlike the rodents, we could like release them even if we were at the manipulation station, because they can easily find their way back to their nest. Finally, I just wanted to mention some information about the necessary authorizations. First, you need to have your protocols approved by the Animal Use Ethics Committee of your university. You will have to describe all the manipulations in details, including the target species and the number of individuals you plan to capture. You'll need also to determine some endpoints, so signs and symptoms that would lead you to, unfortunately, sometimes you have to euthanize the animal if it's in too poor condition. This is really important to avoid unnecessary suffering if the animal is not well. Normally, you have some practical trainings that you can take at your university for all those procedures and manipulations. And also the website of the Canadian Council for Animal Care can provide a lot of documentation of the techniques and the ethical aspects of using animals in research. Yes, and in addition to the ethical certificate, you will also need a specific permit for the wildlife. So for mammals, this is managed by the provincial wildlife departments. In Quebec, it's the permis SEG. For birds, it is managed at the federal level, so it is the Canadian Wildlife Service. And the permits for birds are more difficult to obtain. You have to follow some training. You need some references that attest of your experience. In our case, we had a trained biologist with us in the team who supported for the capture of the birds. Finally, just a quick word on safety aspects. So if you are working with wild animals, of course, there are certain risks. And so there are risks of bites and of transmission of pathogens. So it's important to always be vigilant to that, to protect yourself with the personal protective equipment, at least the goggles, mask, and gloves. It's also important to verify which vaccines will be required in your region, depending on the species you will be handling. And finally, to apply the regular prevention measures for tick-borne diseases if you are working in an endemic area. So here are some references that you can consult if you are planning a field study with capture. And I just wanted to thank Raphael for sharing her pictures with me. In the presentation, I have put some pictures from my project and from Raphael's project. And thank you to all the people who helped me in the field. You can see there are a lot. So these are quite big studies to deploy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariane. That was really, really interesting. And the photos were amazing. It really helps to understand the process when you have so many photos. So I think we can open up for questions now. If anyone has a question, you can either raise your hand or turn on your camera or unmute and just voice your question. If not, I have one or two that can get us started, but I'll just see if anyone else has a question first. Okay, so maybe I'll start. I actually have two questions. Oh, Roman, would you like to go first?
No, just would like to say thank you, Ariane. We also do small mammoth trapping this for the last 5 years, and it's not easy, but we never have had any issues with trapping, and we will do it again. And I hope you will have a success also in your future study.
Thank you, Roman.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I have a question from Damien in the chat. Is there any way to ensure the ticks are live when sampling?
I didn't do that, and I'm not sure. I was putting everything in the alcohol so they would die and we could analyze them in the laboratory. I think I have heard of some people who were using live ticks, and I think they would put it in a tube with like, I don't know, or cut towel, humid, like humidity. So they will keep them alive because it remains humid. Moist. I think moist is the right word. I'm sorry for my English. Oh my God.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to ask a question, or does anyone have any comments related to sampling in the field? Okay, I'm going to ask you one of my questions then. So I'm just curious, I don't know if all of your projects were in Bromont or Quebec, or if they were elsewhere, but I'm just curious how encouraging the province or the local municipality was of this type of research, or whether it was tricky to convince them of the reasons behind doing this research.
Yeah, I didn't work in Bromont. My project was in Saint-Bruno, so it is another city in the southern Quebec. And it was in a provincial public park. And I started back in 2016. And at first, yeah, they were not so happy about all this because they didn't want that, like, the public associate this park to a specific risk for ticks and diseases. But like, it's all a matter of communication with them and to listen to their preoccupation. And at the end, I mean, I saw a lot of evolution in how the managers of the park were approaching the the problematics. And today they are involved in other research projects looking at interventions for tick-borne disease. And at the beginning, I know it was like they were not so sure if they would put like signage to talk about ticks and everything in the park. So yeah, but I don't know, for cities, this was in a specific context of public park. Yeah.
Thanks. And I have a second question I may as well ask you now. You mentioned how the weather can be a problem sometimes and you have to be flexible. I'm just wondering, specifically for ticks, when you're collecting ticks, what parameters are you looking for in the weather before you go out in the field? Like what will stop you going out that day or starting the program?
For ticks, like if it's raining or it rained the day before, it's not good because like the soil is all wet and you cannot collect ticks effectively with the drag sampling methods. But for the host sampling methods, it's really about the animals' well-being. You don't want them to suffer of this whole process and to have hypothermia and stuff like that. So I didn't like look at the influence of host infestation, for instance, related to the weather, but that could be a good question to look at too.
Okay. Thank you. And there's a question from Grace in the chat. Thank you for your presentation. How many of the traps usually had small mammals in them when you checked for them?
Oh, this is really variable. It depends on the, like in one park, I have different trapping success. So in really, really good spots, it can be, I don't know, one out of 3 traps that had a small mammal in it, but in some other place we would not capture any. So yeah, it depends on a lot of things.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments about the topics raised today? No? Okay, so in that case, thank you very much, Ariane. That was really, really interesting. Really appreciate that you put all that together. If possible, I mean, could we, if any of the students here today had any questions, could they contact you by email? Like
yes, of course. Don't hesitate to contact me. And there are some other people in the team at Saint-Hyacinthe that still do field work and host capture. So don't hesitate to reach out if you are interested and we can help out.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I think we can probably stop recording now, Veronica.